The rain fell in lazy drizzles over the gleaming streets of Manhattan, each droplet bouncing off the shining brass entrance of the renowned Grand Lux Hotel. A bellhop, clad in a crisp uniform, swung open the gilded doors as a man in an impeccably tailored suit strode through, his black leather shoes tapping sharply against the polished marble floor. His name was Victor Langston, the kind of man who wore his wealth like armor, his every move calculated to assert dominance over the space he occupied. Victor paused at the concierge desk, raising a hand to silence the young woman stationed there before she could even greet him. "Hold my calls, Amanda," he said curtly, not even looking up as he pulled out his phone. "I have a very important meeting upstairs." Amanda nodded, her face an expertly practiced mask of politeness. The faintest flicker of disapproval crossed her eyes, but she said nothing. As Victor turned to make his way toward the elevators, a man standing in the corner of the lobby caught his attention. The man was slouched against the wall, his tattered coat hanging from his thin shoulders, and a baseball cap shadowed his face. His presence was like a smudge on the pristine canvas of the hotel, and Victor's gaze hardened. "You there!" Victor barked, pointing a manicured finger at the man. The lobby fell silent as heads turned to watch the unfolding scene. The man straightened slightly, revealing a weathered face and tired eyes. He looked at Victor without a hint of fear, a small, calm smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Yes," he said softly, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who didn't often raise it. "What are you doing here?" Victor demanded, his voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't a shelter. You're scaring the guests." The man tilted his head slightly, unbothered by the accusation. "I was just resting for a moment. The rain outside." "I don't care about the rain," Victor cut him off, gesturing toward the exit. "This is a luxury establishment. You have no business here. Leave before I call security." The man remained still, his calm demeanor an affront to Victor's growing frustration. He nodded slowly, adjusting his cap. "I'll leave," he said, his voice steady. "But maybe you should ask yourself what makes a place truly luxurious. The people who walk through its doors, or the kindness shown within its walls." Victor scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Spare me the philosophical nonsense," he sneered. "Out. Now." As the man turned and began to walk toward the exit, Amanda glanced nervously at Victor. "Mr. Langston, do you think that was—" "Not another word," Victor snapped, silencing her with a glare. "This is why I can't stand mediocrity. People like him have no ambition, no purpose. They're a drain on society." Amanda bit her lip, her unease plain on her face, but she said nothing more. The lobby's quiet murmur returned, though a tension lingered in the air as Victor marched toward the elevators. Behind him, the bellhop held the door open for the man to leave, his eyes briefly meeting the stranger's before offering him a small, apologetic nod. As the stranger stepped out into the rain, his calm smile remained, but his eyes betrayed a depth of understanding far beyond what Victor or anyone else in the lobby could comprehend. Victor reached the hotel lounge with a cappuccino in hand, his phone pressed tightly against his ear. His voice was sharp, commanding, as he gave orders to someone on the other end of the line. He barely noticed the disapproving glances from a few guests sitting nearby. To him, his world was the only one that mattered. As he spoke, his eyes caught the same man he'd driven out of the lobby earlier. The stranger was now outside, sitting on the edge of the building's overhang, his shoulders slightly hunched as the rain continued to drizzle. Victor muttered a curse under his breath, ending the call abruptly. "How persistent can someone be?" he grumbled, setting his coffee down and marching back toward the concierge desk. Amanda, still standing there, stiffened at his approach. "Why is that man still hanging around the hotel?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. Do we not pay security enough to deal with situations like this? Amanda hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the window. He's not causing any harm, Mr. Langston. He's just sitting there. Just sitting there? Victor interrupted, his voice rising. That's enough to make this place look like a charity case. Do you know how much our clientele pay to stay here? How do you think they'll feel seeing someone like him lurking around? Before Amanda could respond, one of the waitstaff, a young man named Luis, approached cautiously. "Sir," he began, his tone respectful but firm, "I've seen him before. He's polite and keeps to himself. Maybe he's just waiting for the rain to stop." Victor turned to Luis, his eyes narrowing. "And how is that my problem? Are we running a weather shelter now?" Luis stepped back slightly, clearly uncomfortable, but didn't break eye contact. "Sometimes, people just need a little grace, sir. You never know what someone's going through." Victor let out a bitter laugh. "Grace? That's rich coming from someone who probably hands out freebies to anyone with a sob story. No wonder standards are slipping around here." As he stormed toward the exit, Victor ignored the murmurs that rippled through the lounge. Bystanders exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in quiet disapproval. Outside, he approached the man, his irritation palpable. "Are you deaf?" Victor snapped. "I told you to leave." The man stood, slowly and deliberately, turning to face him. His expression remained calm, his eyes unwavering. "I heard you," he replied gently. "I just hoped you'd think twice before speaking to me like that again." Victor laughed coldly. "Oh, really? And why's that? Are you going to teach me some grand lesson in humility?" The man's smile didn't falter, but there was a quiet strength in his voice as he responded. "You think wealth and power make you untouchable, but you've forgotten one thing." Victor crossed his arms, his patience thinning. "And what's that?" "That every person deserves respect," the man said simply. "No matter what they look like or where they come from." Victor scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Spare me the self-righteousness. You've wasted enough of my time." As he turned to walk away, a small crowd of hotel staff and guests had gathered near the windows, watching the exchange. The tension was palpable, and whispers began to circulate about Victor's behavior. Luis stood near the edge of the group, his arms crossed, his disapproval evident. Meanwhile, Amanda exchanged a look with another staff member, her expression one of growing unease. Victor re-entered the lobby, muttering under his breath. He didn't notice the subtle ripple his actions had caused among the onlookers. Behind him, the man adjusted his cap once again and walked down the street, disappearing into the rain. Victor sat in the private lounge of the Grand Lux Hotel, sipping a martini and scrolling through emails on his tablet. His irritation from the earlier encounter lingered like a bad taste. Despite his wealth and influence, something about the man's calm demeanor had unsettled him. He couldn't place why it bothered him so much. The lounge's hushed atmosphere was broken by the faint sound of murmurs from a group of staff nearby. Victor's sharp ears caught snippets of their conversation, words like incredible and generous standing out. His curiosity piqued. He leaned slightly in their direction, pretending to be absorbed in his tablet while he eavesdropped. "Did you see what he did last week?" one of the bellhops whispered excitedly. "He gave a massive tip to the kitchen staff and told them to share it among themselves. And he's always so polite," another chimed in. "Treats everyone like they're important. Not like—" Their voices trailed off as they noticed Victor glancing in their direction. The group quickly dispersed, their nervous energy making Victor's annoyance flare. Who were they talking about? Was this about that man again? Before he could dwell on it, Amanda approached with a tentative smile. "Mr. Langston, there's something you should know," she said carefully, her voice almost apologetic. Victor raised an eyebrow, gesturing for her to continue. "That man you confronted earlier," she hesitated, glancing down at her notepad as if searching for the right words. "There's something unusual about him." Victor scoffed. "Unusual? Let me guess. He's some kind of misunderstood saint." Amanda shook her head, her cheeks coloring slightly. "Actually, he's someone quite well known. I didn't recognize him at first, but Luis mentioned it. He's Brad Pitt." Victor blinked, the words hanging in the air. For a moment, he thought she was joking, but her serious expression told him otherwise. "Brad Pitt," he repeated, the disbelief thick in his voice. "As in the Brad Pitt. You're telling me that man, looking like a washed-up vagabond, is a Hollywood star?" Amanda nodded, her gaze steady despite his incredulous tone. "He's known for keeping a low profile and helping people in unconventional ways. He's been here before, quietly donating to local shelters. We just didn't realize it was him until today." Victor's mind raced, replaying the earlier interaction in painful detail. The dismissive words, the mocking tone, the outright humiliation he had heaped on a man who could have destroyed his reputation with a single phone call. His stomach churned at the thought. As Amanda walked away, Victor's gaze drifted to the lounge windows. The rain had stopped, and the faint glow of streetlights reflected off the wet pavement. He felt an uncomfortable weight settle in his chest, a mixture of embarrassment and guilt he couldn't ignore. At the corner of the lounge, Luis caught Victor's eye and gave him a pointed look. It wasn't hostile, but there was a quiet judgment in his expression that made Victor feel exposed. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning not only his actions but the man he had become. The voices of the staff, the calm defiance of the stranger, no, Brad Pitt, and the growing whispers of disapproval all converged into one undeniable truth. He had been wrong, and everyone knew it. Victor sat alone in the corner of the lounge, the buzz of voices around him fading into the background. The revelation hit him like a cold wave. He kept replaying the moment Amanda mentioned Brad Pitt's name, her calm delivery contrasting sharply with the storm of emotions inside him. His pride, so carefully constructed over the years, now felt brittle and fragile. For a man like Victor, accustomed to control, this feeling of unease was foreign and unsettling. He had mocked someone who not only had the power to ruin him, but had chosen, instead, to leave with dignity. That man could have exposed him in front of everyone, and yet he didn't. Why? He took a deep breath and glanced out the large window, where the rain had finally stopped. The city lights reflected on the wet streets, and people hurried past, umbrellas tucked under their arms. Somewhere out there, Brad Pitt had walked away, unbothered by the confrontation, his humility leaving Victor grappling with his own arrogance. Memories started to surface, moments he had buried under layers of self-importance. The time he dismissed a struggling intern for a minor mistake. The sharp words he'd used on a waiter who accidentally spilled wine on his jacket. The way he ignored the doorman's polite greetings every morning, too absorbed in his own world to care. Each memory chipped away at the image of himself he had worked so hard to maintain. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his face in his hands. He wasn't used to feeling guilt like this, raw and unfiltered. It wasn't just about Brad Pitt, it was about the person he had become. All his wealth, power, and success felt hollow in that moment. What did it mean if he couldn't even treat people with basic decency? A voice interrupted his thoughts, soft but steady. "Mr. Langston?" He looked up to see Luis standing nearby, holding a tray of water glasses. His expression was calm, but there was a hint of challenge in his eyes. "I thought you might need this," Louise said, placing a glass on the table. Victor stared at the glass for a moment before meeting Louise's gaze. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Louise nodded but didn't walk away. "You know," he began carefully, "most people don't get a second chance to make things right. But sometimes, when you do, it can mean everything." Victor looked at him, surprised by the weight of those words. For the first time, he didn't dismiss them as platitudes. He nodded slowly, a flicker of determination lighting up in his chest. Without another word, Victor stood and walked toward the entrance. The night air was cool against his face as he stepped outside, scanning the street. He didn't know what he was going to say or if he would even find Brad, but he knew he had to try. The rain had left the streets glistening, and the world seemed quieter now, almost expectant. Victor's steps felt heavier than usual, each one carrying the weight of his mistakes. But for the first time in years, he was walking toward something he couldn't control, something real. Victor walked into the hotel's staff lounge the next morning, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet resolve. The staff inside froze, exchanging uncertain glances. They weren't used to seeing him there, let alone without his typical air of command. He cleared his throat, an uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice. "I need a moment," he said, addressing the group. His tone was softer, almost unsure, as if testing words he hadn't used in years. Amanda stepped forward cautiously. "Mr. Langston, is everything all right?" Victor nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before returning to the group. "I wanted to say, I was wrong," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "about how I treated that man yesterday, about how I've treated all of you, for that matter." The staff exchanged looks, a mix of surprise and disbelief. Luis crossed his arms, his expression unreadable, but he didn't interrupt. "I've spent so much time thinking that power and success meant being above everyone else," Victor continued. "But I was blind. That man, I didn't even take a moment to see him as a person. And now I realize I've been doing the same thing to all of you. You've shown me more patience than I deserve." There was a pause, heavy with the weight of his words. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Luis stepped forward, his gaze piercing but not unkind. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong," he said. "But words only mean something if they're followed by action." Victor nodded, meeting Luis's eyes with sincerity. "You're right. I need to change, and I will. I'd like to start by supporting the shelters that man was connected to. If anyone knows how I can reach out, I'd appreciate the help." Amanda's expression softened, and she gave a small smile. "We'll help you figure it out." Victor exhaled, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding releasing from his shoulders. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar yet comforting, a sense of connection with the people around him. He turned to leave but paused at the door, looking back. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice genuine, "for giving me a second chance." Over the weeks that followed, Victor became a quieter, more present figure in the hotel. He worked closely with local shelters, organizing donations and volunteering his time. His transformation didn't happen overnight, but the effort was real, and people began to notice. The staff who once feared him now greeted him warmly, and he took the time to learn their names and listen to their stories. One evening, as he stood outside the hotel, watching the bustling city lights, he saw a familiar figure walking down the street. It was Brad Pitt, his cap pulled low, a calm smile on his face as he greeted a passerby. Victor felt a pang of gratitude. He wanted to call out, but something held him back. Instead, he simply watched, a quiet understanding passing between them as Brad glanced his way and nodded. Victor smiled to himself, the weight of his old ways finally lifting. He had learned the lesson he hadn't even known he needed. True strength wasn't about power, but humility and kindness. And with every step he took forward, he knew he was becoming the man he was always meant to be.